Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can also check us out at Apple, Google, Spotify, and Good Pods. And always please subscribe, rate, and review the show and share it if there are episodes that you really like. Hopefully this one will be one of those. I'm looking forward to this conversation a lot. If you go to the YouTube channel, you can also check out quick take reviews as well as various filmmaker interviews that I've done over the years. And just check out the podcast wherever you listen. You can also check me out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. And this past month, I started a new series over there called Leaving the Collection. It's about movies that basically have kind of run their course throughout their time in my collection. So I basically give them one last spin and do a review about them. And you can also check out brief write-ups on two of the movies that we're going to be talking about today. And that's at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. This episode actually takes the genesis of doing this episode actually goes back to the best of 1996 episode that we did at the end of 2021, and where today's guest brought up one of this filmmaker's films as one of their top 10, and it led to a conversation about that filmmaker and an interest in discussing the filmmaker and more. And he's a returning guest, not just from that episode, but also from past episodes where we've talked about David Lynch, where we've talked about Ed Wood, and it is always a pleasure to talk to Mathew Timms. Matt, thank you very much for joining me again.
Hello, I'm happy to be here.
So the filmmaker that we are talking about is Alan Parker, a British director who passed away a couple of years ago. He is an interesting filmmaker. He's got some really interesting credits to his name. The ones you're probably going to be more familiar with is Evita, Pink Floyd The Wall, which we're going to be talking about, The Commitments, Midnight.
Do you think people would know the life of David Gale, or is that kind of floated into obscurity?
It's weird because that is his last film, but I feel like that is probably one that's kind of lost to obscurity, which kind of blows my mind. But I mean, the fact is, it wasn't that successful when it came out. He also
I remember it wasn't very well received at the time, but like everybody was talking about it.
Yeah. He also did Bugsy Malone. He did Midnight Express. He did Fame. He did Shoot the Moon. And he did Mississippi Burning. And Matthew, you were the one who brought the idea of talking about Alan Parker to my attention. What is it about him as a filmmaker that interested you?
Well, part of it came from kind of a wider idea that when we talk about film, we tend to talk about auteurs. And some people seem to be a little confused about the idea, but the idea of the idea that a filmmaker, that a director is the author of the film, is kind of an academic framework. It's a way to discuss films,
mm-hmm.
And we all know that it's, unless you're like Anna Biller, who does everything, or Robert Rodriguez is kind of the second, basically there's the idea that one person is the author of a film is nonsense, but it kind of makes it easy to talk about these things and say, without having to refer to every single member of the crew and so on. But we've somehow morphed this idea into an auteur is a person who has a distinctive mark. And of course, there are filmmakers like that, like Hitchcock, like Kubrick, like David Lynch, of course, we've talked about. Even Ed Wood, I would argue, is
mm-hmm.
an auteur in a sense, because you can see his passions, his loves. You can see John Waters is kind of the same way. You can see the things that he loves on the screen. But there are other filmmakers who don't have the same kind of mark visually. Like there's so many great either journeymen or people who work primarily nowadays in television who can step into any genre and do it well. Like I remember I brought Michael Curtiz as my example, because he did Yankee Doodle Dandy and Casablanca in the same year. And I was thinking about, I wanted to talk about someone like that. And Alan Parker is my favorite example, partially because even though Michael Curtiz or Robert Wise, for instance, is another great example, they did a lot of different kinds of films, and they were really brilliant. Like you could plug them into any genre and they would do it perfectly. But they were in the days where things were kind of assigned to them. Mm-hmm. So Alan Parker, aside from being a great director and a wonderful talent, he's also a great example of this because he chose his projects. He wrote or co-wrote pretty much everything he did. And the idea that it makes him a better example for this kind of discussion because he chose these projects, he shepherded them, and it wasn't just, hey, next week you're going to start on you're not going to, it's not, you got a sci-fi movie next week, read it up on it,
Yeah.
But he was choosing these projects, he was shepherding them, and he was, making them come to life of his own volition. And it's interesting because you can see how his interests and his passions worked their way into these things, but they're all vastly different kinds of films. They're vastly different style of films. Mm-hmm. And even like if you were to take someone who just has that auteur kind of mindset that's looking for connections, and you were to show them without a title card, if you were to show them Fame and Mississippi Burning, they probably wouldn't know it's the same director. Mm-hmm. Or at least I don't suppose they would.
Yeah.
So that was kind of how it came into conversation, because I thought it was really interesting to discuss this wonderful and unique talent, and also just the fact that I think he's kind of being forgotten a little bit because, his last movie was almost 20 years ago, and because a lot of them are kind of cult classics, but they're not really that available on streaming and that kind of thing. And I just want to pay tribute to this wonderful talent.
Yeah. And honestly, I'll admit I've been I'll admit I'm not as familiar with Alan Parker's work in general. I mean, I think before in preparation for this episode, I think I'd really only seen 3 of his films. One of the ones that we're talking about today, Evita, which was the one that you brought up as one of your 10 best films of 1996, and then his final film, The Life of David Gale. Those, I think, really were the only 3 I'd seen. But I mean, I had heard of pretty much every other major film he had done. But for some reason, he just has not been on my radar as far as somebody to catch up with in a larger degree. And it's funny because of the fact that 2 of the films that we're talking about were first-time watches for me. And it got me really excited to look more into his other work and see Fame and see Midnight Express and see Mississippi Burning, see The Commitments, and see Bugsy Malone and Angela's Ashes, and Shoot the Moon. And the thing is, it's like I listened to A's All Over when it was going a few years ago, and they talked about a few Alan Parker films because he had a lot of films in the early 80s. And you could tell the affection that they had for them. And that affection really has inspired me to want to see some of those. And one of them is one of the ones we're talking about is directly inspired by hearing them talk about on A's All Over. But, going with what you said about the whole auteur theory, and I do think it's one of the big things that a lot of people misinterpret is this idea about the auteur is people saying, oh, the director is the only person who makes the film, which like you said, is not practical. But the idea that
beginnings. Yeah.
Yeah, but the idea that the filmmaker is the guiding force behind them in terms of the storytelling, in terms of a personal thing that they bring to the project. And honestly, I almost kind of want to put Alan Parker in a very distinct manner of that, because I mean, we are going to be talking about at least one of his musicals today, and we already talked about Evita. He is somebody who, when it comes to the use of music in his films, is very interesting in terms of the way he uses it to build character, to build personality into his films. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of, we talked about it during the Best of 1996. I'm not a huge fan of the score for Evita. I think that really does boil down to my biggest issue with the movie. I'm not a huge fan of that score, but I like the way that he found a way to bring those musical numbers to life with his actors. And the one that, and we'll get to it here shortly, the one we're going to talk about is arguably one of the boldest attempts to do a musical I think we've ever seen.
Well, I want to say just first that, if people know him, typically they think, oh yeah, musical guy. But none of his musicals are straight at all. Bugsy Malone's a crazy thing with children and pie fights, and Fame is completely diegetic. It's a drama that has performance in it. You could argue it's not a musical at all if you were willing to be a purist about it.
Yeah.
And Evita's an opera, and The Wall is just this crazy thing that's on another planet. And I guess you could argue it as an opera in a sense, but, the lead character only sings 2 or 3 times, and the rest of it's all like a narrator or in his head or something like that. And so I love that every time he did a musical, he did it in a bold and bizarre way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, but it goes beyond that, though, and we'll talk about more when we get to the other 2 films of his, because one of the things that really struck me about both of those movies is the musical score. And you've known me long enough. I'm a composer, and you know that film music is a passion of mine. And I've loved listening to both of these scores, and especially the collaborators they chose in this case. And it's funny, one of the films we will not be talking about that really is kind of forgotten, Come See the Paradise, is a movie that arguably has spawned one of the most famous musical cues of all time, because you heard it with every other action movie or courtroom drama trailer in the 1990s.
Certainly,
and
yeah.
It's just one of those things where it's like there's something about him and music that I think the way he uses music to help tell this story. And you're right, Fame is not necessarily a straight musical, but that song is like, once you hear that song, you can't not think of it in terms of the movie.
And I Sing the Body Electric has kind of had a life of its own too. Like it's shown up on, it's been covered by punk bands and shown up on tribute albums and things. And I just love that Fame in and of itself, became this huge. It's had this huge afterlife. It was a TV show. They remade it. Like there was a sort of a reality show thing. I don't know if that actually got off the ground, but like the idea that this one film has had such a reach over the decades is also really interesting.
Yeah.
Because, it was R-rated, it was dark, and in some ways very unpleasant. And I love that it has had this afterlife that, nowadays you wouldn't really expect.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And, it's one of those movies where it's like, it's entirely possible I saw that when I was younger. I just don't remember it. But if I don't necessarily remember it, I just basically say, oh, well, I clearly didn't see it then. But
Well, I first saw it on TV, and I saw it in an edited version.
mhm.
And then when I finally saw the full thing, I'm like, oh, this is a very different movie.
Yeah.
Because I see it and it's all R-rated glory. And, I'd seen the TV show as well, and I was fond of that. But then once I saw the unedited version of the film, I realized that, oh, they like neutered everything for the show.
Yeah.
Like almost all
Yeah.
the stuff that was really interesting was gone. And so I kind of liked the show less afterwards because it felt like an inferior kind of version. Although I know they had standards and practices to deal with, so it's not necessarily their fault. But
oh yeah, and you have to think if they did one now, if they did TV version of Fame now, I mean, it would probably be on cable or streaming, and you could basically you wouldn't have to necessarily neuter it.
Oh, it could be amazing, yeah, if you did it, if you had the right creative team behind it, certainly.
Oh yeah. But let's go ahead and get started. And it's funny because all three of all of these movies basically came out back to back to back, essentially, in his career. And we're going to start with 1982's Pink Floyd, The Wall. And this is obviously an adaptation of the Pink Floyd album, 1979 album. And it was written by Roger Waters and has just really striking animation to it. And the movie stars Bob Geldof, who is another musician, as Pink, a musician who basically is going crazy for a variety of reasons, and it basically boils down to it's basically a 90-minute dive into his psyche. What was your first experience with whether it was did you listen to the album first or did you see the movie first?
Oh, I'd heard the album first, and it was probably 2 or 3 years before I was able to track down the film because, it's like Blockbuster didn't have it. And, I eventually wound up getting, one of my friends let me borrow a bootleg that was like 6th or 7th generation. So it looked muddy and nasty and I could barely see it, but it was still powerful enough that I could get the gist of what it was, So it wasn't till it's another thing that like once I finally got the DVD, I could actually see it and realize, the film was powerful enough as it was, but actually getting to see more detail of it, and it was really, really interesting. And so I'm going to turn to you in a second because I want to know your side of it, but it was really fascinating because having heard the album, hundreds of times and memorized practically every note of it, it was really interesting to see how striking some of the departures were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm like you. I listened to the I listened to the album before. It was in the mid '90s or so when I got into Pink Floyd. Partially because I started listening to Dark Side of the Moon, Animals, and some of their other stuff. And it was around the time Division Bell came out. And a couple of years after that, I went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was shortly after it opened, and got to see the wall display that they have there, which is absolutely fantastic. And it's still there. If you get a chance to go up there to Cleveland, it's completely worth. It's a great experience if you're interested in rock music history, and if you're a Pink Floyd fan, going to see that in particular is terrific. So it was about '96, I think, is when I saw the movie for the first time, and it was I think I'd seen it off of MTV, so it was kind of abridged. It wasn't. I don't think it was completely, the version that was made, but it still left an impact on me. And then I bought it on video. Eventually got the DVD, and now I'm patiently waiting for somebody to. I'm guessing it's a rights issue with the music is one of the main reasons why why it's not really available on Blu-ray. And I would love to see Criterion pick it up, or one of those specialty
like
labels.
Arrow or Vinegar Syndrome or one of those guys. Yeah, they do a marvelous job with it.
Yeah,
certainly.
So I mean, it was, and it's funny because of the fact that, like, I think when I originally wrote my review was in August of 2000, was coming off of one of my grandfathers passing away, and I was in a pretty dark place, and so watching this is, the thing that you really realize is that this is a really somber movie in a lot of ways. And I mean, a big part of it is the album, a big part of it is the music, which is very intro. It deals with a lot of emotional concepts, a lot of psychological concepts, and Pink is somebody whose mind is breaking, and he really is not able to process life. He's going through a divorce. He's tired of the night to night on tour. He lost his father during World War II, and it's one of those things where it basically everything gets to him, and he is primarily in a hotel room, basically having delusions, psychological hallucinations, and this is where the animation by Gerald Scarfe really comes into play, because his animation design in this is absolutely fantastic. It's really striking what he does, and the way that he and Parker work together to shape this film in a way, in a way that a lot of people kind of dismiss this as a 9-minute music video. And I can certainly see where they're coming from, but you do really see, if you really pay attention to it, you really do see the narrative come through in a way that's kind of profound.
And part of what I love about the animation is, of course, it's very satirical, and it, harkens back to some of the other satirical animators of that period. There's a touch of Terry Gilliam, there's a touch of Ralph Steadman, there's a lot of, that kind of thing in there. But a lot of it is also really fascinating because it kind of moves at the speed of thought. Like, I love that a bird becomes a bomber, becomes, the cross bleeds and becomes a flag. Like, I love how everything morphs from one thing to another in a way that follows a strange kind of logic. I love that it isn't just random images, but there's things that thematically make sense, and there's things that flow together, and it's one of those things that it's almost impossible to describe how good it is, because it isn't just, here's a bunch of random shocking images, which is what a lot of people who try to do surrealism now try to do. They're just, here's a bunch of weird shit, and yay, it's shocking. But everything kind of has a logic to it. One follows another, and these flowers turn, vaginal and phallic, and and it becomes, the subtext becomes very literal, and I love how it actually is integrated and it makes sense, and it isn't just weirdness for its own sake.
Yeah.
But one of the other things I wanted to mention, you mentioned it as a music video, and I guess you could call it that if you wanted to be dismissive, but a lot of people don't quite understand, I don't think, that music video as an art was really in its infancy at this point.
Yeah.
Most music videos that you would see on MTV at that point were promo videos. It was concert footage and maybe them driving a car on a mountain or something. And the idea of like a music video that told a story and had a texture and was more like a film, with the exception of someone like The Residents who did experimental stuff, you basically just didn't see that at that time.
No.
So the idea of that didn't come in more to the 90s. And now that I think back on it, it's kind of amazing what bizarre, surreal things we got to see on MTV, bumped up against, pop singers too. Like, but, at that point, music video was a very new art that was just barely figuring itself out. At one, except for the really crazy ones, like I alluded to, like you look at the video for "Video Killed the Radio Star," and it's just them performing on a set.
Yeah.
And that was considered mind blowing at the time. And it wasn't, and Thriller hadn't come out, so you didn't have Billie Jean yet. You didn't have Beat It. You didn't have the Thriller video. So the idea of music video as an art was something that was kind of coming, but it wasn't something that an audience, I think, would have been prepared for.
Yeah.
And there's a story, and I don't know how true this is, but I love the story that at the premiere at Cannes, supposedly when the lights went up, Steven Spielberg was heard saying, "What the fuck was that?" And the producer just kind of bows at Alan Parker and smiles. And
yeah.
So,
I've heard that story enough to where I do believe that probably happened. I mean, that's hilarious because of the fact that it's hilarious because that would have been probably the same can that E.T. played at, and
right.
which had a rapture. I mean, it's wild to imagine this movie came out the same year, the same summer as E.T., as The Thing, as Blade Runner, as Poltergeist, and it's just absolutely mind blowing.
And I know, that in spite of what some people think of him, Spielberg is a genuine film fanatic. He does love all kinds of films. So even though people think of him for the family-friendly movies, like he does love all kinds of movies. He's a big David Lynch fan. He's a big fan of, and so the idea that this was too out for him at the time really means something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, absolutely. And I mean, you've got. I can see where he's coming from. I mean, this is one of those movies where if you're not necessarily prepared for something like this in terms of what in terms of what your cinematic diet is, I can completely see this being what the hell am I watching and what am I listening to? I mean, also, I think there is a familiarity. If you have a familiarity with the album, I think the film will be easier to digest.
Oh, I can imagine if you walked in not having heard it, or maybe just having heard Another Brick in the Wall Part 2.
Yeah.
What a strange slap in the face that would have been.
Oh yeah, it's you can't even. I can't even imagine. It's funny when I was watching this. I was thinking about it, and I'm a big Guns N' Roses fan, and it's like you've got to think that when they did the videos for like November Rain and Estranged and Don't Cry, that trilogy of videos, you got to think that Axl Rose had this movie in the back of his head because it's very much that you can tell in terms of what he's trying to what they're trying to do in those videos in terms of alienation, in terms of just sadness and depression is basically comes from this.
And that would have been what, 10 years later?
Yeah, it would have been about a decade later.
Yeah, so to think how far ahead this was, certainly.
I think this is, I one of the things that makes this such an interesting musical is the fact that it's a rock musical, which was still kind of relatively new for audiences. Like we hadn't really gotten into the idea of contemporary music being possible for like musicals yet, and really we still kind of haven't. I mean, I think like for the most part, most people's ideas of musicals still kind of harken back to like West Side Story, Singing in the Rain, Sound of Music, and stuff like that. So, I mean, the idea of this being a musical, it's kind of you can kind of see where somebody coming to this now could think, oh, well, this is just a long music video. You don't really think about it as a music video, but I do love the way that the story, the songs in this movie tell a very definite story of alienation, of just psychological torment. And I mean, it goes to some really dark places, but it also goes to, especially in the last third of the movie, it goes to some really darkly hilarious places. And that's where the animation comes in.
Well, and one of the things that's very interesting about this is that it is very universal, but also very specific. Like, it's a very autobiographical story from Roger Waters' perspective. It's very much about Syd Barrett, but it's also about every British person of that period, because almost everyone had someone who died in the war. Yeah. They lost someone in the Blitz. They either were alive during the bombing of London, or they were one of their family members was. They know it secondhand or something like that. So Alan Parker and pretty much all the great British musicians from that period experienced this. And if you read the autobiography of Ozzy, or you read any of the books by or about the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, or just anybody from that period, World War II hangs really large in their memory in a way that I think we can entirely grasp here in America. Because I know we've had 9/11 and we've had tragedies, but I don't think war is really as upfront and real to us as it was to the British during that period. And so it's a really strange case of being universal, but also very much inspired by 2 or 3 particular people.
No, I definitely think that is. I definitely think you've got a point there, especially with, and we see it so much nowadays in political discourse. So many Americans really. When something inconveniences them, they consider tyranny, and they consider it, and they use dialogue that compares it to the Holocaust. And it's like, without even taking into consideration just how inconsiderate that would be for survivors, let alone people who, of especially the Jewish faith, who see anti-Semitism as something that really is not gone away, unfortunately, and is continuing to rear its ugly head nowadays. I mean, you definitely do bring up something. I mean, even after 9/11, like you really, we don't really look at. It's hard for us, I think, it's sometimes hard for us as Americans to look at something that negatively impacts somebody else in a way that we can identify with. I think that's something that I think that's something that is kind of hard to wrap our heads around. And even after 9/11, I think that's the case.
Well, and you have to also remember that there's a whole generation of adults who were born after 9/11. So it's just a vague idea to them.
Yeah.
There are people alive now who are adults, who can vote and drive, and I think even drink now, who can be shipped off to war, who have never known an America that wasn't at war.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the idea that you and I grew up in a very different world than they do, that is kind of mind-boggling. And I have to sometimes remind myself that what we grew up with was different. Mm-hmm. And sometimes their perspectives are so far off because they didn't have it in their face.
Yeah. No, I mean, that is that is an excellent point. One of the things we haven't really touched on yet that I definitely want to touch on because it's one of the more interesting aspects of the movie is this idea that Pink imagines himself as a fascist. And a big part of that is you see the theatricality of the lead singer in a lot of bands and a lot of biopics. You see that it's something that you are larger in life and you basically have these people worshiping you on, you have them in the palm of your hands in a very real way. And one of the things that's really interesting is how you have a musical number like Another Brick in the Wall, which is basically against the idea of conforming to society, while at the same time, Pink imagines himself as somebody who is going to insist that you conform to his values. And I think that is one of the most, and we talked about this, I think, a little bit. There was a post on the movie around, I think it was leading up to the 2016 election. And, where, because of the fact that, the concern was there of Trump being an authoritarian, and you could see the MAGA cult kind of build itself. And it's interesting. It's interesting to see that this sort of happen in real life, where rebellion against conformity or against what you think society wants you to be like, leads to demanding conformity to your values.
Oh, definitely. And it's using fascism in particular. It's a strange thing because a lot of artists use that as kind of an iconography and a bit for shock value, but then it gets muddied. There was a point in about the time you're talking about discovering the film, Marilyn Manson was using fascist imagery in his stage shows, and I was never clear whether that was just for shock value or if in some level he really kind of dug it. Mm-hmm. And I don't pretend to know his mind, and I wouldn't propose that we pretend to know what's going on in his head, in particular now that he's gotten very far down the road in drugs and seems to have lost the intellectual capability that he used to speak with. But, it's there, kind of every generation. If you look at the early days of punk, if you look at the decline of Western civilization, there were bands that, started using punk imagery. And some of them did it just for shock value because it was that idea that this is something that's not allowed, so we're going to do it as a kind of a fuck you to the system. But other people really believed it. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of hard to ferret out who is who. And, so it was really interesting to kind of see that people, especially now, some people are really embracing a lot of these things non-ironically, clearly with no sense of irony, with no sense of distance. And there are a lot of people who are really buying into the authoritarianism. And it's so strange that in some ways the concerns of 1982 are the concerns of now. Yeah. And a lot of the things that they brought up in Evita also are things that we're seeing now. Like, I don't want to get too far down this road because it could just kind of run the whole thing aground. But, if you look at so much of Evita is based around infighting and political power and coups and things like that. And, The Lady's Got Potential, almost the entire song is about that. It's who took power when. And, we're lucky that the people in January 6th were bumbling idiots. Yeah. Like the fact that they had no plan, the fact that they were dipshits is the only thing that saved us. Mm-hmm. And I honestly don't know if we're going to be so lucky next time. Yeah. And I'm afraid that, for all we know, this next coming election could be the last free election we have. And I hope that's not true, but I don't know. And it's so frightening to think that these things that we thought we had put to bed are here again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean that was one of the things that was so concerning about Trump. And I mean, honestly, you're talking about the early '80s. I mean, you're also talking about the potential World War III. You're talking about the potential. You're talking about Satanic Panic, which was in its infancy around the time the Wall came out. But you're seeing that back again with QAnon and with Russia trying to invade Ukraine, and the potential, what is that going to lead to? And you see all of these things, and you're right, like so many of these fears that were around in the early 80s are back again, and can we fight them off this time? Or is it going to be something where there's going to be a generation that just willingly invites them in and to take over? And that is one of the things that's really striking about that. But yeah, we don't want to get too much off of the films themselves.
Before we leave that, I do want to just bring up one idea. The idea that Pink sees himself in this way. Do you think that is a personification of his fears about himself? Like, do you think that the way I've always sort of interpreted it as his wife has left him, his father abandoned him, the way he sees it, his mother was overbearing, all this, the teachers were overbearing. So the way I always interpreted that was he looks at himself and says, I'm a monster. And what's the scariest thing he can think of would be a Nazi. Right. And so the idea that he's essentially making the outside resemble what he feels he is inside. And I just kind of wondered if you had an angle on that or what you thought about it.
I think that is, I think that's a perfectly reasonable read on the text. I think you can definitely read that into the text. And it also just, because of the fact that, I mean, you have this idea, we have, you always kind of have this idea of artists as, this idea of the tortured artist, which is cliched to the nth degree. And I think the idea of that is very valid in what Waters is writing about in The Wall, whether it's the screenplay or the album. And I definitely think there's part of that because of the fact that you certainly get, if basically everything you've been told your life essentially leads to several different no's, or like, no, you cannot have a happy home life because your father is not around. No, you will not have your father. You don't have a father figure, so it's like, how are you supposed to act like a man? And no, your wife is not interested in having you anymore. That is going to build up, and you see it explode in, I think, and at a certain point you just get numb. I mean, that's the whole point of Comfortably Numb as a song, is that you basically just get to this point where there's nothing else you can do except just wallow. And it's a brilliant, I mean, Comfortably Numb's probably my favorite song from the album. I'm not sure, it's one of my favorite stretches of film here. I think this Bring the Boys Back Home and Mother are just really haunting and powerful pieces of filmmaking from Parker.
And I love the way they reorchestrate Mother, especially like the dance sequence and stuff, like with the strings and everything. But please go on.
No, I was gonna say, the reorchestrations of the music in this by Michael Kamen are fantastic. It is absolutely fantastic. I love the way the music sounds in this movie. It's part of the reason it pisses me off that we don't have anything beyond the DVD, because of the fact that I would love to hear this remastered in a way that just envelopes you. And I would love to see this on the big screen, ideally.
Oh yeah,
because I've never seen it theatrically. But
you can on the DVD you can still hear the tape hiss and stuff in parts of it, and it could definitely use a little cleaning up for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to say, since it came to mind, that scene where the young Pink is on the playground trying to find some kind of father figure is just devastating.
Yeah.
And so many of those little bits and pieces, like when he's wearing his father's uniform and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and to him it's just dress up. Like he doesn't yet understand what it means. Like, it's so haunting and terrible.
It really is. And I did want to mention, I mean, Bob Geldof is fantastic in this movie as Pink. He really captures the sense of isolation. And it's really, he doesn't say a lot in the film, but his physical performance is amazing. It's absolutely fantastic. And but Kevin McKeon, who plays young Pink, I did want to point him out because you're right, he is absolutely terrific in this movie. You see in the little boy the man that Pink is going to become, and you see that isolation really start to set in on his face. And it's just absolutely fantastic. Bob Hoskins as his manager is terrific. Jay Wright, who's a groupie who comes to his apartment, who comes to his hotel room, is absolutely terrific. This movie is just such a dark fever dream of a movie. It really is nightmarish. And that's one of the things, like we talked about earlier. It's like I can't imagine anybody who hasn't heard the album already coming to this and knowing quite what to think about it. But
certainly not.
Yeah, I love the way that it. You listen to the album and you can feel the narrative flow, and I love that. There are some songs here, and a big part of it is the orchestration. The way that Alan Parker and this is where the musical aesthetic comes to. It takes the big songs to this grandiose, this grandiose moment where they are showstoppers. If you're using the traditional parlance of what we talk about when it comes to movie musicals. And whether it's animated, whether it's a collage of images, it's just absolutely haunting, and it is absolutely brilliant. This is one of the best movies I've ever seen. It really is just amazing.
And one of the things that really struck me watching it again, especially, is that second version of In the Flesh that's at the rally is almost ritualistic. Mm-hmm. There's almost something religious about it, which fits because the Nazis were very superstitious, and some suggest they were into occultism and things like that. And it fits so well, but it's so dramatic and tense. And but there's something also about how some of the smaller moments work. Like Mother is probably one of the most effective numbers, if you want to look at that in that sense, because it spans this huge amount of time and it doubles back on itself so much, but it has meaning both in the present and the past. And Young Lust kind of has that too, where it's about discovering girls at one point, but there's also the groupies. It's about feeling sorry for himself because his wife left him. There's all these things happening at once, and it's all these layers and different moments of time colliding on themselves in this one song. And part of what I think is really interesting about the movie is that you could have kind of just filmed the album and it would have worked well enough. But I like that there are moments that are filled in further. Like if you listen to the album, you can kind of tell that his wife left him, but it isn't nearly as prominent or important as it is in the film.
Yeah.
Like, and I love the dislocation of time, like the fact that something that happened 20 years ago, something that happened yesterday, something that happens now, or potentially something that's happening in the future, they're all happening in this moment.
Yeah.
There's an almost Dr. Manhattan-esque sense to it that I don't think anyone in 1982 could have really been prepared for.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely this is such a devastating film. It's such a striking film. And in a way it's very nihilistic too because of how bleak it is. But it's a movie that if it really is a shame that it's not more readily available now, because I think it should be. And
there are a lot of people in this younger generation that I think would really embrace it, and a lot of it's if they could just get to it.
Yeah, or it's something like Fight Club, where they'll take the completely wrong lessons from it. So it could go either way.
That's going to happen. Yeah, there's going to be some misinterpretation. Like when I was in high school, one of my classmates was a neo-Nazi who loved Taxi Driver, and I'm like, God, you really didn't understand that movie, did you, brother? No, not at all. So unfortunately, if you want to make challenging art, you have to deal with the fact that somebody's not going to get it.
Yeah, and
that's another conversation, perhaps for another show. But
yeah,
we can't get too deeply into that now.
But let's jump off of Pink Floyd The Wall, because I mean, granted, I could talk about this. I could talk about this movie even more. But I do want to get to the other two films that we're talking about. The second one is 1984's Birdy, which stars Nicolas Cage and Matthew Modine, and as two friends who we see their friendship largely told in flashback, and the present day context is Birdy is in a mental institution. He was shell shocked by Vietnam, and Al, the Nicolas Cage character, is trying to get through to him, and Al was severely injured in Vietnam as well. And it's basically about these two friendships. And this is the one that really, listening to them talk about an 80s all over, partially because of the fact that I'm a huge Nicolas Cage fan. I love Nicolas Cage as a performer, and I really have wanted to get more into his earlier work. But also because of the fact that this has the first film score by Peter Gabriel. And if you know me, you know how much I adore his score for The Passion of the Christ. It's one of my absolute favorite scores of all time. So, you want me to get on board with your movie, put Peter Gabriel's music to it. Had you seen this before I suggested it?
I had not, no, and I'm glad that I had the reason to look it up, because it was very striking, and it's so interesting because it winds up falling in line with The Wall in a lot of ways, just because it's got the flashbacks and the flash forwards, it's got the wars, it's got the war aspect, it's got this and that, but one thing that really fascinates me about it is that it's set during Vietnam, which was pretty reasonably close to the present at the time, but at the same time, everything looks older. Everything looks like it could have been in the 40s. Yeah. So in some ways, Alan Parker can't get away from World War II in a sense. And so there's this kind of there's a decay to the film that's really interesting, and you see that a lot in Fame too, where you just look at the school and the streets of New York, and everything's dirty, and the paint is peeling off the walls and things like that, and you just kind of don't see that in a lot of films now. Everything's too clean, and so it's got really weird textures that are very interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense exactly, but
No, it does. And I mean, the fact that you mentioned that it feels like it could take place in the 40s, I think that's an interesting. I think that's very true because of the fact that you do get this sense. You don't really get this sense other than looking at things in terms of some of the vehicles, some of the cars that we see, and some of the technology that we see is largely you wouldn't know that this took place before in the Vietnam era. More likely in the 60s or 70s. You wouldn't think about it. But this movie was really I love this movie because of the fact that it's not only very sweet in terms of the development of the friendship between Al and Birdy, but also it plays to this idea of, again, one of the things that we see throughout the movie is that Birdy really cannot seem to connect with humans. Birds feel like he's more at home interacting with birds. And, one of the things that we are really seeing is we're seeing somebody who went through a traumatic experience. And we don't really get the impression before the war that he dealt with a traumatic experience. He just is something that it's just something where birds were more of his obsession than interacting with humans. And, you have to kind of wonder, it's like, does what happens to him in war simply make him realize that he's just incapable of connecting with humans at all, even going so far as to not be able to really communicate and connect with his best friend?
Well, I think the war hastened it for sure, but I feel like he was on that road for quite a while. And it's a very sweet film, but it's also funnier than I was expecting.
Yeah.
Like the scene with the bird breeder talking about the Roman orgy and all that was very funny. Like there's a lot of little bits that I didn't expect. Even when he and Al are on the beach talking about breasts, like there's something very human about it. But I like that the humor comes from the characters and isn't necessarily a bit. It's very human and kind of lyrical, and the structure of the film almost is kind of lyrical in a way, and it follows in a vague sense, but it isn't strictly logical.
Yeah.
And you could really wonder, it must have been a difficult, I know, the novel apparently was very fractured, so it must have been very difficult to decide when he was doing the screenplay, like, where do I put this scene versus that one, and how do I flow these together? Because I just imagine the structure of it must have been a nightmare, and it plays beautifully now, but I can only imagine it must have been so hard to figure out how to put the pieces in together. One thing I did want to mention, by the way, is that I like the friendship a lot because when we see male friendships on film and on television and stuff, a lot of times they feel like kind of like bits to me. Like I know that guys bust each other's balls a lot. I know that there's a certain teasing and a give and take, and male friendships tend to be rowdier in some ways than female friendships, but a lot of times when I see these kinds of friendships on films and on TV shows and things, I wonder, they don't even like each other. Like it feels like there's nothing connecting these people. And this felt fairly genuine. Like this felt like two people who really, really love each other, even though they have really nothing in common.
Yeah.
Like they keep to each other, even though they're from different planets, kind of.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the hardest things about this movie, and it's another case with Alan Parker basically trusting his narrative in a large degree to a character who doesn't really talk. Like we don't, it doesn't feel like, I mean, especially since a lot of it takes place in the mental institution. We see Birdy in the mental institution, and he's not talking. And one of the big things that Al is trying to do, he's trying to get him to talk, to communicate, because he doesn't want what's going to happen next for Birdy to happen. And it really takes a lot of bravery to, in a film that is not, structurally speaking, a silent film, to trust your movie to a character whose dialogue is either virtually absent or is very kind of nonsensical, not really exposition there, doesn't really deal much in exposition, or giving us verbal blueprints into the character themselves. That takes a lot of courage, and it's one of those things that you really do kind of appreciate about Alan Parker as a director, because of the fact that what it does is it's him putting his trust in his storytelling on the images and on the physical performance that he's going to get from these actors.
Oh, and one of the things you also have to think about is that Al is reacting the whole time. He's not really driving the narrative at all.
Yeah.
He's reacting to everything. And so, in a sense, he doesn't really push the story forward at all. So he just reacts to what's already going on.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he's sort of the audience surrogate in a sense. So it does take a lot of trust to expect the audience to go along with that.
Yeah.
And I know some audiences wouldn't, to be honest. But I think enough of us did that it has a certain place.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, Cage is such a fascinating performer. And one of the things he really doesn't get a lot of credit for, and it's for a variety of reasons. Partially, it's because of some of the types of roles he plays. Some of it is just the sheer amount of crap that he's ended up making for a wide variety of reasons. Is he's somebody who can ultimately, as crazy as he can be on screen, he can also bring a lot of empathy to a character. And a lot of people point to Leaving Las Vegas, but one of my go-tos in that respect is always when he is Sean Archer in Face Off. When he is the John Travolta character in Face Off, there are scenes between him and Joan Allen in that movie that are just absolutely just heartbreaking and beautiful, because of the fact that we've seen what that character goes through, and you see the exhaustion, you feel the exhaustion in his voice, and you feel the emotion in his voice. That is just absolutely wonderful, and you really get a lot of sense of that in Birdy.
I kind of wish that he would do more dramas now, because like I loved Willy's Wonderland and some of these things. Like he's done some really fun films, but I know he has this huge range, and I'm not often seeing it these days because of some of the roles that he picks or has picked for him. I don't know the circumstances specifically, but a lot of the I'm lost the title of it, but you look at the Wicker Man remake, and it's just like, oh well, you can do better,
Yeah.
Like it's just I feel like for a while there, especially, his talents were wasted. Even though some of them were really fun to watch, like I don't think they were quite up to the standard of what he could do.
Yeah.
Like for a long time, I said half kiddingly that the last movie of his I liked was The Weatherman, just because I want to see more of that kind of role from him.
Yeah.
But he's always had kind of crazy things. Like if you look at Peggy Sue Got Married, he's really weird in that one. So, he's always had the two sides.
Yeah.
And part of what interests me about him as a performer is that he was able to kind of swing for these fences. I think of him in a weird way, although they're very different. I think of him a little bit like Vincent Price, because who is my favorite actor, by the way. And what I love about him was he could be super campy. He could be very restrained. He could be quiet. He could deliver a stage performance. I feel like there's something of that in Nicolas Cage as well. It's different, and it's focused in kind of a different area, but there's a similarity there, where you can kind of morph into a different mode depending on what the role demands. A few years ago, I would have said that about Johnny Depp as well, but that's not been true of his last few films, and I suppose we'll leave that there.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm trying to say.
No, I mean, I definitely do. Have you seen Pig yet?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yeah. And he was really wonderful in that.
Yeah.
Very restrained.
Yeah. I was kind of hoping that I was kind of curious if you had seen that, because he was. It's one of my favorite films of his. Honestly, he was just. I love that it was essentially sold as one thing and it became something completely different. It really gave him a chance to dive into something more emotional and more personal than we've come to expect.
I don't want to get too far off topic, but have you seen The Man Who Killed Hitler and Then the Bigfoot?
No, I have not.
With Sam. Okay. Based on the title, you're expecting a very exploitation film.
Yeah.
But it's more like Pig. It's more of a drama that just has a crazy premise. And so there's a couple of those things out there now that are getting very interesting, where you are kind of sold one thing and you get something that's better that you're not expecting.
Yeah. And, one of the things I do want to... one of the things I want to talk about in this movie is the use of music, because this is something that, I mean, not just in the movies that we think of when it comes to using music, from Alan Parker, like Fame, like Pink Floyd, The Wall, like The Commitments, and Evita. I think the way he uses music is very interesting. The choice of Peter Gabriel in this, it gives it a feel. It gives the movie a feel that is really unlike what a traditional like orchestral score could do. I think it gives it an off-kilter and unorthodox sound that really works for the film.
I do think it works for it, but it's kind of wrong in a way because it's anachronistic. Like it's far too modern for the time period it's set in. And I think something about the music being too modern, but the look being too old, something about all of that meshes together in a way that makes it really interesting. And I can't quite put into words what that is, but there is something really unique about it, because it's, and Evita has this too, to a degree, where like it's too modern and it's too retro kind of at the same time.
Yeah. What did you think of the use of La Bamba in this movie?
I am not entirely sure what to think of it, honestly, because I know it, like the scenes are fun, and but I also, and they're certainly fitting because that song would have been popular at the time.
Yeah.
But I kind of feel like there's something there I'm missing. Like I'm supposed to get something else from that music choice that I don't. And I'm not sure if I'm just missing something or if it was just supposed to be a fun song.
I think to a certain extent it was a fun song. I think the way that he uses, my interpretation of it is the way that he uses it, the fact that he uses it multiple times, basically is kind of in the same way that Kubrick uses some of the classical pieces in 2001, where it's not strictly what we consider orchestral scores, but he basically uses these as specific cues to get to certain ideas. I mean, like, the Blue Danube being used during space flight, also Sprach Zarathustra being used with the next form of human evolution, Legady's Requiem being used with the monolith. And I think with La Bamba, I think it's kind of interesting that he uses a film, he uses a song by a recording artist who died in a plane crash to represent moments of like Birdy and Al kind of doing these crazy things, and one of them including trying to fly in the in the landfill. But I think and I think that's one of those things that's really kind of interesting is he uses it he doesn't use it in terms of saying a time period so much as he uses it as an emotional representation, the way some people would use musical themes.
That's an interesting thought. And another thought that just kind of occurred to me while we were talking about it is that the song is very slyly sexual. Mm-hmm. Like the whole, I'm not a captain, I'm not a sailor, I'm a captain. But there's this influence that there's a sort of a wink and a nod, like, well, for you, baby, I will be a sailor. And so it kind of makes me think of the recklessness of youth is what I'm getting at. Mm-hmm. Like that kind of crazed hormonal feeling you get at that age. And I think maybe that's part of it too. And I hadn't thought about that previously.
I think that's I think that's part of it. And I mean, I think I think to a certain extent it's part of, I mean, especially true because of when it's used at the very end and the final shots of the movie and the way it ends. Which to a certain extent you don't necessarily see coming, but I think if you look at the way La Bamba is used almost as a musical theme throughout the film, it really does point to the fact that Al and Birdy kind of bring out the most fun parts of themselves, of each other, in their friendship. And I think that's another. I do think that's something that's. I do think that's something that Parker is going for in the musical choice, as well as the youth. As well as the idea of youth and rebellious youth.
And there's also the fact that the ending is strangely kind of abrupt.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of push to it, and then just kind of happens. And there's something kind of interesting about that too, because you're desperate to know what comes next, but you're denied.
Yeah.
And the fact that it plays on some level almost like a joke, like, well, I don't have anything to say, like there's a very strange kind of humor to it. That's something, it strikes me as very British, and I might just be reading that into it, but
well, and I think to a certain extent it is the idea that Birdy, I think to a certain extent it's Birdy, showing Al how comfortable he is with him. And just being able to make that joke towards him is something that matters to him. So,
yeah. One of the things that I did want to bring up, you mentioned the cars earlier, and I think it's really fascinating that when you see a lot of movies with classic cars, they're almost always in pristine shape because they're lent by collectors. And so it was so interesting to see so many of them that were dirty and had holes in them and rust.
Yeah.
And it gives the film such a weird lived-in quality. And you see that again with our next film as well, but we'll get to that when we turn there. But I'm kind of fascinated by the way everything feels lived in.
Yeah, I do really I do really like that the way that Alan Parker wants to bring an authenticity to things, even when things get kind of out of control into the realm of the surreal, and I think you kind of see that in The Wall as well, and the ways that he brings he brings that particular time, those particular times in England to life, the ways that the production design you see in the hotel room, in the concerts, in just the standing room, auditorium at the end with him going full fascism. I think that's something that there is an authenticity to the world that is important, especially for Parker, especially if he's got movies that, to a certain extent, go into a little bit of the surreal. And I think there are parts of Birdy that go into surreal aspects.
There is a grounding sense to it in a way, because this is familiar. And not to get too far into The Wall again, but I was thinking just for a moment about some of the songs like Bring the Boys Back Home and stuff that feel very much like some of the British songs that you would have had to sing along in a pub, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's so in a weird way, it's kind of harking back to a time that no longer exists. It's playing on memory and nostalgia in a certain sense. Same with Vera, Mm-hmm. And I feel like kind of doing the same thing with some of the American music, or, well, I know La Bamba's from Mexico, but, it was popularized in America. So you know what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the movie La Bamba, the Ricky Valens biopic, when was that in relation to this film?
It was a few years later. It was 87. It was after this. So
okay, I couldn't remember. All right.
So yeah, the movie, the song had not quite come back into popular culture because of La Bamba.
Newfound popularity, right?
Yeah, it was still a couple. Yeah, it was still a few years off, and who knows? This might have been the reason producers decide, hey, maybe we should do a biopic about Ricky Valens.
Yeah. So I hadn't thought about that again until just now. Like, oh yeah, but when was that in relation? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was a few years later. Yeah, I mean, Birdy is. I think it's on Tubi right now. I think it was on. I think it's also on Prime as well. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, it's available there, and it's well worth watching. It's really, if you're a fan of Nicolas Cage, if you're a fan of Matthew Modine, and if you're a fan of Alan Parker who hasn't seen it, yeah, it's well worth watching.
And it's fascinating to think that, for many other filmmakers, that would be the greatest film they ever made.
Yeah.
And for him, it's just one in a row, mm-hmm. Really great things. So it's kind of fascinating to see what he was able to achieve and then go on to other great things.
Yeah, it's funny because of the fact that you see these prompts on Twitter, a lot of like best director, best 3 for 3, from a director, and a lot of people go McTiernan, a lot of people go Spielberg, Scorsese, the 3 that we've got here from Alan Parker makes a pretty good case. We've got Pink Floyd, The Wall, we've got Birdy, and then you've got 1987's Angel Heart, and This is one of the ones you want to talk about, so I'm going to let you introduce it.
Well, it's a very strange film that because it's kind of a neo-noir, it's kind of a horror film, it's kind of an update of ancient mythology in a sense, and it's kind of not like anything else I can think of from that era. Like, there were a couple of good neo-noir films like Blue Velvet and things like that, but this kind of has a horror all its own. It's got a texture and a vibe that's different from everything else. and it is very interesting. It's interesting personally to me because I wound up in a script that I've written and hope one day to make, so I won't spoil too much of it. I had written a character that looks almost exactly like Lou Cipher, like down to the fingernails. And when my wife read it for the first time, she kind of says, "Have you seen Angel Heart?" I said, "No, why?" And she's like, "Okay, we're gonna watch that." And then we watch it a few days later, and I'm like, "Oh shit!" and it was so funny because I don't know if I saw an image from it and subconsciously it seeped in or something, or if it was just a coincidence, like two people having similar thoughts decades apart. But I wound up in a very real way kind of ripping off this thing that I hadn't seen yet. and there were also thematic similarities, so I had to go kind of rewrite some of it and stuff. Actually, that quote from Tiresias, "What use is wisdom if it brings no comfort to the wise?" I had in that script. Like, okay, I got to get rid of that too. And so in a weird way, it's so interesting because it runs parallel to something that to things that I've been obsessed with, and to think that it exists in such a beautifully fully realized form already was really fascinating. I don't know if I can if that makes sense without having read my version, but like the idea that these things that were in my head apparently were also in someone else's.
Yeah.
Decades before. Like, it was really fascinating to kind of pick those out. And one of the reasons I wanted to pick the film, aside from the fact that I just love it, is that also it's a good kind of opposition, because if you talk about the musicals and things like that, you talk about kind of the straight dramas, and then you go for what is in a lot of ways a horror film. This is something that someone who's in that strict auteur everybody's fingerprints thing wouldn't expect from Alan Parker.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because it has that same kind of broken down, lived in feel. It's got the decay and the rot and all that kind of stuff. But it also has it's set in the 50s, but there's flashbacks to earlier times, and so World War II plays a part in a sense.
Yeah.
And there's like thematic connections, but they're much looser. It isn't a film about the war strictly as much as the other two are. And so I like that it you can see connective tissue, but it isn't as direct, it isn't as obvious.
Yeah. No, and this was my first time watching it. But I mean, this movie's been on kind of my internal watch list for a while because of the fact that it's Alan Parker, because of the cast, because of some of the stories that you heard. Famously Lisa Bonet, who was on the Cosby Show at the time. She, Bill Cosby was not terribly happy with her very explicit role in this movie, especially during one of the crazier sex scenes I think I've ever seen in a movie.
Oh, certainly.
And but also it has a score by Trevor Jones, who I have always been a fan of. He's somebody. One of my first scores that I just absolutely loved was his score for the 1995 remake of Kiss of Death, which is another neo-noir film. And
that one yet, but it sounds intriguing.
It's a Nicolas Cage movie actually, and but it was also one of David Caruso's big starring roles after NYPD Blue. So, but it's got a massive cast. It's really a terrific. It's a good B movie film noir. I'm not going to make a case for it to being a great neo noir, but it's an entertaining one for a lot of the cast that's involved. But Trevor Jones, he did music for that. He did music for Dark City. He did From Hell, the Hughes Brothers film. But he also in the 80s he did The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. And he also did 2 films for Alan Parker in Angel Heart and Mississippi Burning. One of the things that I'm really intrigued by in Jones's score here is his use of jazz, which makes sense because of the fact that it's film noir, neo-noir, and one of the tropes that you see in a lot of neo-noirs, this use of jazz music and that type of jazz orchestration. And it's about a private detective played by Mickey Rourke who is hired by a mysterious businessman played by Robert De Niro to look for a former big band singer who disappeared after World War II. And you know, you've already talked about the style to a certain extent, and I love the way that this film looks. In it feels very contemporary, but you can see it feels very contemporary in terms of the visual style that is brought to it, but the production values, like you said, it's very period. It comes from the 50s, 40s. You definitely get that impression as well. And I think the score by Jones really illuminates that, both with its use of jazz as well as some more contemporary ideas like synthesizers and stuff like that that play a part in the score as well.
Well, and one of the things I find very interesting about it, and I don't know if this is intentional or if I'm just reading too much into it, which is a possibility, by the way. I noticed that scene where where he's reading through the doctor's stuff, and he sees that front break revolver. That's the same kind of pistol that Pink's father had in the wall, and I wonder if that was intended to signal that was his service revolver from had he been in the war previously. And so there's a lot of things like that kind of hint that he may have been in the war, he may have been in the service, and that in some way connects him to some of the other characters and the kind of shared trauma that they've been through and things like that. Or it could just be that was what the prop master had. I don't know, but it's a very, but that's a very British firearm, and this story takes place in America, and so I can't help but think it was a deliberate choice.
Oh, and yeah,
there's a lot of little things like that are just very particular details that I don't always necessarily know why they were chosen or what they mean, but they feel like they have a greater resonance.
No, and I think that's a very astute observation. I do think you're probably onto something as a way for Parker to connect, where this story's headed, and to give us the idea of where it's headed, because of the fact that it's like you do get the feeling with any of these films that when Alan Parker makes a choice, and we didn't talk about the cinematography and some of the Skycam shots in that to bring to mind Flight, which it's basically early drone shots, and it was designed by Garrett Brown, who famously designed the Steadicam, and that's a very particular shot that Alan Parker wanted to do. And in here, I think something like placing that gun, the way that the music goes from this more contemporary feel into more a jazz feel, it really brings to mind this idea that this film is not just very old-fashioned in terms of when it takes place and the type of genre it is, but the idea that you're going to get to a place that is really upsetting and really unsettling. And I think the more contemporary aspects of the score kind of play into that, and because the transition to a horror film that this movie makes is seamless. You don't really question it.
And this is also kind of a pet thing for me. I've always held that horror and noir were kind of cousins, because you see so many similarities in the style, in the expressionist stuff, in the shadows and things like that. But also, if you look at horror films of the 30s, except for ones that are set in a particular past, they're wearing contemporary clothes and suits and things. So they're dressed like, the 30s and 40s. They're dressed like the people in the noir films.
Yeah.
And so there's something very interesting about the two of them together that I feel like it wouldn't be fair to say that they're one and the same, but they borrow from each other so much that I often feel like they're connected. And in a lot of noir films during that 40s period were really horrific. They were, really pushing the limits of what you could do on screen. Like the torture scene in Kiss Me Deadly is one I think about a lot because, even though it's tame by modern standards, it was a big deal for its time.
Yeah.
And, and even you look at some of the sort of neo-noir films, and I think a lot about Blood Simple, which is, definitely inspired by Dashiell Hammett and that kind of thing. But, the character gets buried alive. Like, it's really savage. And I feel like these threads are kind of woven close together. And I feel like as time goes on, you mentioned Dark City as well, because that's a film that owes to horror and noir almost equally in a way.
Yeah.
And I feel like these things are very close to one another. And it's so interesting that here's a film that brings them both out. Here's a film that brings them together in a very literal kind of way.
Well, I mean, you also think about German filmmakers who, the German expressionist filmmakers from the 20s and 30s, who when they came to Hollywood, what movies were they making? They were making horror films. They were making film noir. Fritz Lang is one of the best examples of that. And so the two genres have always been hand in hand, really. And so it's interesting to see as film noir was coming back into style in the 80s with stuff like Body Heat, with Blood Simple, with Angel Heart, that you see these elements of horror and these elements of genre really coming into their own. I mean, Blade Runner, look at Blade Runner. Blade Runner is a science fiction film noir. I mean, it's kind of the best of both worlds, and Darkseid is the same way.
Well, and of course, Blue Velvet gets into this too, because, it's very modern in terms of clothes and hairstyles, but it's got these very old ambulances and cars and things. And so, it does kind of mix and match. So there was something kind of in the air at that time. And my suspicion is probably that these old films were easy to license at the time, so they played on TV a lot. So they probably influenced filmmakers at that period. And I assume they were playing in revival houses quite a bit. And I don't, have receipts on this. So if someone wants to call me out later and tell me I'm wrong, I'll definitely take it. But it just seems like there was kind of a revival of the style. And And one thing I wanted to kind of transition to is how much religion plays a part of this. And since it's a fairly obscure film, I guess we shouldn't blow the ending. But because I can't trust that the listeners will have seen it quite as easily as some of the other films we may have talked about in the past.
Yeah.
But there is something very horrific about the history of world religions, and there's something about a kind of savagery to them that is in full force here. And it's exotic because it's voodoo, but there's also the film does kind of mirror and wink at a little bit some of the similarities in the Christian mythology and that kind of thing. And I think it's really interesting the way it kind of puts them together.
Yeah.
And I don't, I'm not an expert in this, and I'm certainly not a practitioner by any means, but I read a little bit about voodoo because world religions is a passion of mine. And um, voodoo is a very interesting case because it was a Haitian polytheistic religion, and Catholic Catholics came in and tried to convert them. And what happened was the voodoo practitioners accepted Jesus as a god, but as one God of many.
Right.
Like they didn't quite get the whole message that he's supposed to be the only one.
Yeah.
So if you see a shrine, a legit shrine of a voodoo practitioner, you will often see a crucifix along with the hand of glory and the other such things, because Jesus is now one of their gods.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really fascinating that this film kind of takes this religion that to us seems exotic, but has a connection to something we're more familiar with and plays on those connections.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I certainly would not want to, I certainly wouldn't want to step on the ending on this either, because of the fact that it is like you said, it's a movie is maybe not as familiar as, is not really as familiar as a lot of the other ones we've talked about. Certainly in terms of David Lynch's work, which I mean really plays on that, not just Blue Velvet, but I mean, you know, when we talked about Mulholland Drive, when we talked about Inland Empire, and even Lost Highway, have that combination of film noir and horror that really play into them. And I mean, he's somebody who's basically made a career, because I mean, you look at Twin Peaks, it's the exact same way.
Certainly, yeah.
But I love the use of New Orleans as the backdrop, as the main backdrop here. I mean, it starts out in New York and then goes to New Orleans. I love the character of Charlotte Rampling plays in this movie. Mm-hmm. She really adds something to it. De Niro is it's chilling how De Niro plays this character, and he plays him very upfront and very very personable, but you can also see a bit of the cold-blooded De Niro as well.
I love that scene with the egg,
yeah.
Because in mythology, eggs, represent life in a certain way, and he's cracking it, and one thing I found out recently that really fascinates me is that his nails get longer in each scene, but only like a tiny little bit, like imperceptibly. So it's not supposed to be something you notice, but it's just something to kind of needle with your head a little bit. And I love those kinds of details. So for anybody who is seeing these films for the first time, go to Alan Parker's website, because he has really in-depth articles about all of his films. He wrote sometime, obviously, before he passed, but some of them were written for DVD inserts, and some of them were written for magazines, and I guess some of them were probably just written for the site. But there are pages and pages and pages of really great detailed information on the background and production of these films. And if you read the Wikipedia entries, they're often just quoting those articles.
Yeah.
So if you want to really get into these films and try to get into his head a little bit, go to a site and read those, because they're really fascinating.
Yeah, and Mickey Rourke in this movie, he is such a great actor for that traditional film noir private detective who basically gets in over his head. And I it's interesting because of the fact that, I mean, if you're familiar with Rourke, now more than likely you're familiar with basically anything from The Wrestler on, which is not necessarily representative of who he is as a performer. I'm still very much a novice in terms of a lot of his work in the 80s, but you see something like this, or 9.5 Weeks even, or just a small role in Body Heat, And you can see that there's something about him as a performer that's very natural and very captivating to watch.
There's something deeply sexual too. There's something about he's very handsome, but in an almost beat up kind of way. And so it's ironic that he became a boxer and wound up messing up his face. But like there is sort of it is kind of fascinating that there is this kind of sexual subtext that he just brings with him in that period. That like he didn't really have to play it; it was just there. And there's also something really striking about De Niro being so handsome and but still off-putting at the same time. Like there's something really interesting about the way he attracts and repels. Kind of, I think of Lugosi as Dracula in a sense. There's something very foreign about it that, especially in the Victorian time that Lugosi would have played it. There was a definite sense of something deeper going on there, and it's one of those things that whenever my wife is used to seeing De Niro now as he is now, the elder mob type character that he tends to play often, the more comedic roles. And so, there's times where she's like, oh yeah, young De Niro can get it. Oh my goodness. Like he had such a different power back then.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because of the fact that this came out the exact same year as The Untouchables, and seeing him as Al Capone in that, like he has that exact same presence, but it's much more. The way he responds is much more extrovert. It's much more of a he's bringing his physical presence to the table in the way that he really doesn't in Angel Heart, but it's just as menacing all the same.
And that's a few decades removed from the period, but it's kind of similar enough that a modern audience would go, oh yeah, it's in the past, whatever, but there is a certain drive to that performance that Lou Cypher doesn't have. Like Cypher's much quieter.
Yeah.
He's much more sinister in his way. I kind of, one of the things I love those broad campy villain performances, and I mentioned Vincent Price here, but like I also kind of like those performances where you really have to lean into the villain to hear what he's saying. There's something alluring about that because you have to get closer, but it's more dangerous, and so there's that push and pull that's really interesting. And I will say, as a sort of a nod to anyone who has seen the film, I think it's really interesting that Lou Cypher hangs around a church that preaches the prosperity gospel. I think that's very intriguing, and I suppose is probably a fairly pointed remark. But I won't say more for potentially ruining it for someone who hasn't seen it yet.
Yeah, this is a wonderful piece of film noir as well as horror that really is it's something where it's another it's another character that kind of gets too far into his head to a certain extent. And
certainly, yeah.
And you can kind of see that being this case with Pink as well, and Birdy. And I think it's interesting that you have these characters in all three of these films by Alan Parker who are sometimes they're so invested in what's going on within them that they kind of lose sight of the reality of situations. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing that kind of ties all three of these movies together.
Well, and in the case of Angelheart in particular, it does harken back to Sophocles very much. Like the way he structured his tragedies was there were usually in the form of Tiresias, but often other characters would be saying to the tragic hero, like, "Don't go down this road. This will lead to your ruin. Don't do this. This is a terrible idea." And of course, they would tell him to piss off and go straight forward anyway. And I kind of love that this is that, that structure is there in a modern context.
Right.
Like you see it in Shakespeare too, but it's structured differently. But the tragic hero always has this several opportunities to turn back.
Mm-hmm.
And he could have just gone home so many times. Like he could have gone back to New York and it would have been fine.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was the money or if it was that sense of not wanting to leave it unsettled, or I don't know what it was specifically that motivated him, but like there were so many times where he could have turned back and he could have just said, "Okay, fine, too deep for me, I'm gone, forget it." But he didn't. And it's so interesting to see something from thousands of years ago and something very contemporary kind of coming together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have any more thoughts that you want to share about these movies and Alan Parker in particular before we wrap up?
Well, I could talk so much about all of them. It's so complicated because there's just so many ideas that I'd love to play on. But one thing, since we are talking about characters leading to their ruin, I did want your opinion on something. In The Wall, on the album specifically, it begins and ends with the phrase, "Is this where we came in?" Which is a reference to, for some of the younger listeners, it used to be when you went to the movies, they would just have stuff playing all day and you just bought a ticket and went in, and you could go in whenever and hang out for as long as you wanted. And so a lot of times people would come in the middle of a movie and they would wait till it all came around again and they say, "Oh yeah, I saw this part. Okay, let's go." And some people interpret that phrase being used in that way to mean that what Pink is going through is a cycle that he will just repeat over and over again until his death. But I tend to look at it more as he's breaking that cycle now. And hopefully after the trial, he's going to wise up and try to become a better person. And I want to know what you feel, if you have an opinion.
I'll be honest, I had not really thought about that. You look at The Wall, you look at how it is, you look at how it is structured, and it's interesting that you think you look at it as Pink might be finally breaking that cycle. And I do kind of see, to a certain maybe it's because I might be a little bit more pessimistic about it. I kind of see him. I do kind of see him. This is kind of where he lives now, and this is like he's at that point of no return, and there's nothing that can really resonate with him that brings him out of it now. I think that is kind of interesting because of the fact that you would hope that when Comfortably Numb happens, that's basically the point where it's like he's hit rock bottom. He's basically bleeding out, on almost basically suicidal at that point. And the whole point of something like Comfortably Numb is I'm at peace with my misery. I'm at peace with my depression to the point where I'm just ready. And then when he comes out of it, he finds himself ready to lead. He's ready to take himself as a leader of people to society's ruin. And so, to a certain extent, I kind of look at that. It's funny. I almost look at that as that's him hitting the point of no return, where there really isn't redemption for him. And I like your version better because of the fact that it does imply the fact that there is a way back from that depth of despair and that depth of feeling. I'd much rather prefer that, but I almost look at it as the opposite.
Well, there's something very interesting about that metaphor, and I'm going to try to tie this into a broader thing if you'll give me just a second to get to it. But so much of the building blocks in this story are things that have multiple uses. Like a brick can build something or it can smash a window. A hammer can break something as easily as it can build something. A wall can protect you, but it can also isolate you. Right. And so these metaphors are kind of, and so one could look at tear down the wall, that refrain, as, we're going to do it. We're finally going to break free of this cycle and everything is going to be great. Or it could just be like, well, we're just going to rebuild it, you know, like, and the children picking up the rubble at the end, is that a memory of his childhood? Is that the start of a new wall, perhaps, And so it's very interesting. And I think that a lot of that kind of metaphor was probably what interested Alan Parker about the story. Like, I know he spoke dismissively about the film because it wasn't very well received and it was so experimental. He thought of it kind of as a student film, but I don't think he quite realized what he had achieved with it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting, partially because he didn't have people like us telling him how great it was, that I don't think he quite understood what he was able to do with that. And if you look at some of the ways that things cross-cut and run through time, in a weird way, he's taking something here that he's going to use for the rest of his career. Like in this one film, he's experimenting with techniques that he's going to use forever. Yeah. Like if you look at Evita, it's the structure is much more conventional compared to that, but it also, as far as musicals go, is kind of crazy. Mm-hmm. And, so a lot of the ways the violence is intercut with those bits of Perun taking off his jacket and the Descamisados cheering and things like that. He's using a version of a technique that he created there. Yeah. Or that he refined, he's refining it to something that's a little more palatable. And with Birdy, there's this cross-cutting between time and that kind of thing. And with Angel Heart, there's some of that, because the past is important to that story, because you've got to look at you're trying to find a person who's been missing for a decade. How do you do that specifically? Mm-hmm. And so it's so interesting to me that in this one a kind of messy film, he's creating the building blocks of something that he's going to use forever. Yeah. And but it doesn't feel like it feels a lot of times when you see something that's an experiment, like you look at The Lodger, you look at Hitchcock, you see a lot of techniques that he'll use again later, but it feels in some ways not fully realized. But in this film, it's a fully realized film in its own right, but he's still going to refine these techniques as he goes along. Yeah. Yeah. And I do wonder, and you'll notice that he never really gave that level of control again. Like Roger Waters is a very demanding personality and a very strong I don't mean egotistical necessarily as a negative, but he's a very demanding kind of person to work with. But you look at most of his other films, and with the exception of maybe a co-writer, he is shaping it more on his own. And I wonder, how much of that was just like, no, I don't want to do that again, and how much of it was just like his own choice. Like, I worked with that strong personality, and I don't want to do that again.
Right.
Let's get someone who's a little more amiable.
Right.
No,
that's no. I mean, that's an interesting. That is an interesting thing, and yeah, I mean, watching these three movies for this episode really, it not only makes me appreciate even more about Alan Parker in general, but it makes me interested to see those films that I have not watched from him yet.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
And I definitely appreciate you bring him to my attention as a possible subject. And it was great to really great to dive into his work a bit more and really get me excited about watching more of his films in the future.
And not all of them are big downers like this. Like Bugsy Malone is light and silly, and and even though Fame is very dark, it does have its moments of levity. It does have some really beautiful human moments, and Birdy does too. So I'm speaking more to the audience here. If you're just like, oh God, these are all depressing, I don't want to do that, give them a chance, please. And I hope that I hope somebody goes in, hears this, and decides to try to hunt some of these down.
Yeah.
Because I feel, like I said before, I feel like he's kind of being forgotten now, and that would be a big tragedy.
Yeah, it definitely would. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and yeah, I mean, you can definitely, like I already told you where you can find Birdy on. I think Angel Heart is on the Stars app, but both of those are readily available for rent, so you can definitely check those out. Pink Floyd The Wall, I think, is really kind of the only one that's harder to find, but it's basically because of the fact that I do believe it's probably legal issues with the rights and the music rights. There's and plus the fact that MGM films have basically jumped from studio to studio over the past 40 years. So
yeah, I don't know who's got what at this point.
Yeah,
and I know that Amazon has bought MGM, but I don't know which ones they still control right now.
Yeah.
So I hope that some of them find a home in Amazon, but I don't know if that's going to happen.
And the DVD I have of The Wall is from the Columbia Music Video label. So it's basically from it's basically from Columbia's music department. So who the hell knows what that means at this point?
Certainly. But yeah, like Evita's easy to find, Bugsy Malone's easy to find. Some of these you have to pay $3 or $4, but they're there.
Yeah, yeah. But Matthew, as always, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to thank Matthew for joining me today to talk about Alan Parker, and I'd like to thank him for bringing the idea of talking about Alan Parker to my attention, because of the fact that it really did make for a great conversation, I think, for the two of us. That's going to be it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. September and October, November, and December are going to be kind of nuts, but I'm looking forward to the variety of guests, the variety of subjects, and you're going to hear some people you've never heard before on this podcast. You're going to hear from people that you've definitely heard from before on this podcast. And either way, I'm looking forward to those discussions. That's going to be it for this episode of the podcast. Check me out again at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema, at the Sonic Cinema YouTube channel on as well as Apple, Google, Spotify, Good Pods. And finally, as always, my written work is at www.sonic-cinema.com. Thank you very much.